When I showed up for the family dinner that evening, I wasn't expecting anything unusual. Same faces, same food, the same lukewarm conversations about who's doing what and who's failing at life. It was routine, predictable, and honestly, a little comforting in its mundanity. I didn't realize this dinner would change everything. The first red flag was how everyone was already seated when I arrived. My mother, always running late, was already pouring drinks. My dad, a man of few words, was unusually animated, joking with my younger brother Jason. Even the silence felt charged, like static before a storm. Still, I brushed it off. Maybe I was just tired. I took my seat, greeted everyone, and noticed Jason couldn't stop grinning. Not the casual, polite kind. No, this was smug. Smug enough to make me suspicious. My mother, though, beamed at him like he had just won the Nobel Prize. It made no sense. But before I could ask anything, Jason clinked his glass. "Big news," he said, practically glowing. My brain filled in the blanks. New job, maybe a promotion, or he'd finally paid off that ridiculous car loan. Nothing could have prepared me for what came next. Jason's smile widened as he dropped the bombshell. "I'm getting married." To Megan. For a moment, the words didn't make sense. Megan. My ex-wife Megan. My stomach flipped and my vision tunneled, but their faces brought me back. My mother's gasp of joy, my father's approving nod, and Jason's barely contained laughter at my reaction. They knew. They all knew. A rush of questions flooded my head, but none of them formed into words. How long had this been going on? Did Jason pursue her before or after our divorce? Did my family, my own family, keep this from me? I looked at my mother, expecting something, anything, to indicate she understood how messed up this was. But all I saw was a twisted version of pride, like Jason had achieved something remarkable by stealing what was once mine. My dad didn't even glance my way, his focus entirely on Jason as he muttered something about finally settling down. Jason's grin widened. He leaned back in his chair, enjoying every second of my discomfort. The audacity of it all. He hadn't just taken Megan. He had turned my family into cheerleaders for his betrayal. And here he was, daring me to react, almost begging for it. My hands shook under the table, but I kept them hidden. I couldn't give him that satisfaction. I tried to piece together how this could have happened. Megan and I had been divorced for a year. Things weren't perfect between us, but the idea that my own brother would swoop in, it felt calculated, like he had waited for his chance and struck the moment my back was turned. My mother broke the silence, going on about how happy she was for Jason and Megan. She gushed about how Megan was a perfect match for Jason, as though Megan hadn't once been married to me. It was surreal. I wanted to scream, to make them see how absurd this all was, but the words caught in my throat. Instead, I stood up. The movement silenced the table. My chair scraped loudly against the floor, but I didn't care. I needed air, space. Anything to escape the suffocating weight of betrayal hanging over that table. Leaving so soon? Jason's voice dripped with fake concern, but I could hear the mockery beneath it. He was enjoying this, every second of it. I didn't respond. My mother called after me as I walked toward the door, her voice tinged with confusion and disappointment. I didn't look back. I couldn't. If I had stayed a moment longer, I might have done something I'd regret. As I stepped outside into the cold night air, the weight in my chest only grew heavier. My mind raced, replaying the scene over and over. Jason's smug grin, my parents' approval, and Megan's absence. She hadn't even bothered to show up for this grotesque announcement. Maybe she knew how humiliating it would be for me. Maybe that was the point. I walked to my car, the night swallowing me whole. I didn't have answers, only questions that burned hotter with every step. But one thing was clear, I couldn't go back. Not tonight. Maybe not ever. When I got home, the silence was almost unbearable. The walls seemed to close in, amplifying every racing thought. sitting on the edge of my bed. I tried to make sense of what had just happened, but the weight of it all was crushing. My brother, my ex-wife, my family's complicity. It was too much. And yet, the memories came rushing back, uninvited and relentless. Megan, and I hadn't started out like this. I'd been head over heels for her when we first met. She had this way of lighting up a room, of making you feel like you were the only person who mattered. Back then, we had shared everything. Dreams, secrets, plans for a future that seemed so bright it was almost blinding. Our wedding was small but perfect, filled with laughter and hope. I could still remember her looking at me like I was her entire world. But things didn't stay perfect. Over time, the cracks began to show. The arguments started small, as they often do. Disagreements about money, work schedules, and trivial things that should have been easily resolved. But those cracks widened, and soon we were yelling about things that didn't even make sense. The love that once felt endless now felt conditional, every interaction tinged with resentment. Then came the nights when she didn't come home. At first, she had excuses. Late meetings, car trouble, helping a friend. I wanted to believe her. I clung to the idea that we were just going through a rough patch, that things would get better if we just tried harder. But deep down, I knew something was wrong. The way she avoided my eyes, the way her phone was suddenly glued to her hand, the way she stopped caring about the little things that once made us, us. It wasn't until the end that the full truth came out. I'd found messages, ones that shattered any remaining illusions I had about our marriage. She had been seeing someone else. She swore it was a mistake, a one-time thing. But the trust was already gone. The final months before the divorce were a blur of pain and betrayal. And now, sitting in my room, it all felt like it was happening again, only worse. The thought hit me like a freight train. What if Megan and Jason had started this while we were still married? It wasn't just a possibility. It felt almost inevitable. Jason had always been around, always eager to help with things when Megan and I were struggling. At the time, I'd been too consumed by my own insecurities to question it. But now, looking back, the pieces fit together too perfectly. The lingering glances, the way she'd laugh at his jokes even when I didn't find them funny, the way he always seemed to know more about our problems than I'd ever told him. And then there was my family. They had to have known. My mother's excitement tonight wasn't the reaction of someone hearing news for the first time. She had embraced Megan as if she'd never left the family, as if I was the outsider in my own life. My dad, always stoic and reserved, hadn't said a word to me. He'd simply nodded along, like everything about this was completely normal. The realization was like a knife twisting in my gut. They had known. Maybe not the entire time, but long enough to make their silence feel like betrayal. They hadn't just turned a blind eye. They'd welcomed it, supported it, and in doing so, chosen Jason and Megan over me. The people I should have been able to trust the most had been complicit in the destruction of my life. I sat there for hours, the anger and hurt swirling together in a toxic mix. Sleep was impossible. All I could think about was how blind I'd been, how naive. Everything I thought I knew about my family, my marriage, my own brother, it was all a lie. And now, I was left with nothing but questions I wasn't sure I wanted the answers to. The next morning, my phone wouldn't stop buzzing. The first call was from my mother, her voice sharp and cutting, as she accused me of being selfish for walking out of the dinner. According to her, I'd embarrassed Jason, upset the family, and failed to show support for his new beginning. She didn't even pause to acknowledge how twisted it was to expect me to celebrate his engagement to my ex-wife. When I didn't respond the way she wanted, she hung up, only for my father to call shortly after. My dad's tone was less emotional, but no less infuriating. He skipped straight to the point. Jason and Megan were planning a big wedding, and Jason's finances were stretched thin. Apparently, they needed someone to step up and help cover the costs. The number they threw at me was absurd. $85,000. I laughed out loud at the audacity of it, but my father didn't even flinch. He insisted it was the least I could do to make amends for my behavior. Amends? For what? For refusing to cheer on my brother's betrayal? I told him no, firmly, definitively, without a shred of hesitation. The moment the word left my mouth, I heard the disappointment in his silence. He didn't argue or push back. He simply muttered something about how Jason deserves better support from his family and hung up. It was clear whose side they were on. But the real blow came when Jason showed up at my door later that evening. I didn't know whether to slam it in his face or let him in and face whatever smug nonsense he had come to deliver. Against my better judgment, I opened the door, and there he was, grinning like he had already won whatever battle he thought we were fighting. He started with a casual pretense, asking how I was holding up after the dinner. It didn't take long for his true intentions to surface. He wanted to make sure I understood that Megan was with him now, because I had failed her. He painted a picture of himself as her savior, the man who had stepped up when I couldn't. His words were calculated to provoke, and they worked. The anger I'd been holding back since last night boiled over. I told him exactly what I thought of him, of Megan, of the whole farce they were calling a relationship. I made it clear that I wanted no part in their lives, their wedding, or their future. Jason tried to counter, claiming the family would always back him, but his voice wavered. For the first time, I saw a crack in his confidence. He wasn't as sure of himself as he wanted me to believe. When he left, slamming the door behind him, I felt a strange mix of anger and relief. I knew this wasn't over. Jason was too proud to let it end here, and my family's loyalty to him meant I'd likely hear from them again soon. But for now, I had drawn my line. No matter what came next, I wasn't going to let them drag me into their twisted version of normalcy. The calls didn't stop, one after another. Relatives I hadn't spoken to in months suddenly had plenty to say. They all followed the same script, urging me to be the bigger person, to set aside my pride, and to understand how hard this is for Jason. The hypocrisy was suffocating. None of them seemed to care how hard it was for me, how their endless pleas only added to the weight pressing down on my chest. The one that stung the most came from Aunt Jessica. She'd always been the one family member I thought I could count on. But even she had bought into the narrative that Jason and Megan's happiness outweighed everything else. She spoke to me like I was a child throwing a tantrum, her voice dripping with condescension as she told me to stop being so stubborn and to think about what's best for the family. I couldn't take it anymore. The next time my mother called, I told her I'd come to the family meeting she was organizing. If they wanted to confront me, they could do it to my face. I was done with the passive-aggressive phone calls and guilt trips. When I walked into my parents' house that evening, the tension was palpable. My mother stood near the kitchen, arms crossed, wearing a look that screamed disappointment. My father sat in his usual chair, silent as ever, but his eyes betrayed his unease. Jason, of course, was front and center, his smug grin firmly in place. Even a few extended family members had shown up, eager spectators for the family drama. I didn't waste time with pleasantries. I stood in the middle of the room and asked them outright what they wanted from me. My mother was the first to speak, launching into a rehearsed speech about unity and forgiveness. She framed it as though I was the one tearing the family apart, completely ignoring the role Jason and Megan had played. My father chimed in, urging me to reconsider my stance and to think about how my actions were affecting everyone else. Jason, predictably, took a more direct approach. He accused me of being bitter and jealous, of refusing to let go of the past. He claimed Megan had moved on because I hadn't been enough for her, and that he was simply stepping up where I'd failed. His words were designed to cut, and they did. But I didn't lose my temper. Not this time. Instead, I looked at each of them in turn and asked a question that had been burning inside me since that disastrous dinner. Do any of you even care about what this has done to me? The silence that followed was deafening. For a moment, I thought I saw a flicker of guilt in my mother's eyes, but it was gone as quickly as it appeared. No one had an answer. Not one of them could look me in the eye and justify their actions. I took a deep breath and told them exactly how I felt. I laid it all out, the betrayal, the hurt, the utter lack of respect they'd shown me. I told them I wouldn't be part of their charade, wouldn't fund their wedding, and wouldn't pretend that any of this was okay. When I was done, I waited for their response. My mother started to say something, but I didn't stick around to hear it. I turned and walked out, leaving them to stew in the mess they'd created. As I stepped outside, the cold air hit me like a slap to the face, but it felt good. It felt real. For the first time in days, I felt a sense of clarity. I wasn't going to let them drag me down any further. Whatever came next, I was done playing the scapegoat in their twisted family drama. In the days leading up to the wedding, I wrestled with the decision. Part of me wanted nothing to do with it, to let them celebrate their charade without me. But another part of me felt compelled to show up, not as an act of support, but to prove that standing firm in my values wasn't weakness. If they thought I'd break under pressure, they were wrong. When the day came, I walked into the venue with my head held high. The tension in the air was immediate. Jason's friends avoided eye contact, and some relatives shot me pitying glances. My mother, ever the actress, greeted me with a forced smile and a barely audible, "I'm glad you came." It was clear my presence was more about optics than reconciliation. Megan was easy to spot. She was at the center of the room, dressed in an elaborate gown that screamed extravagance. Her demeanor, however, was colder than I expected. She barely acknowledged me, her focus entirely on Jason and their meticulously choreographed celebration. Jason, on the other hand, couldn't hide his smugness. He moved through the crowd like he'd won some grand prize, his gaze occasionally flicking toward me, as if daring me to react. I stayed quiet, observing. The ceremony itself was as hollow as I'd imagined, a spectacle of rehearsed vows and exaggerated emotions. By the time the reception rolled around, I was ready to leave, but then I saw the microphone being passed around for toasts. Something inside me shifted. If this was the stage they'd chosen, I was going to use it. When it was my turn, I stood and took the microphone, feeling the weight of every eye in the room. I started with a polite acknowledgement, a nod to the effort that had gone into the event, but then I let the sarcasm seep in. I spoke about the importance of trust, of loyalty, and how those qualities were the foundation of any meaningful relationship. My words were laced with double meanings, each one a thinly veiled jab at Jason and Megan's betrayal. As I continued, the atmosphere in the room shifted. Some guests squirmed in their seats, unsure whether to laugh or stay silent. My mother's face was a mix of anger and embarrassment, while Jason's smugness finally cracked. Megan's expression was unreadable, her eyes fixed on the floor. I ended my toast by wishing them the best, a genuine sentiment, but one that carried an undertone of finality. I wanted them to be happy, but I wasn't going to be a part of it. With that, I handed back the microphone and walked out. The silence that followed me was deafening. Back at home, I poured myself a drink, feeling a strange mix of relief and sadness. It was over. I had said my piece and made my stand. The night passed quietly, but the next day brought an unexpected surprise. There was a knock at the door, and when I opened it, there stood Megan. She looked different, vulnerable, almost fragile. She told me she had barely slept after the reception, unable to shake the feeling that she'd made a mistake. Her words were hesitant, full of doubt. She confessed that she wasn't sure if marrying Jason was the right decision, that she'd felt lost and unsure for a long time. I let her speak, but I kept my distance. When she finally finished, I told her the truth. I wasn't angry anymore, but I couldn't save her from her choices. She needed to take responsibility for her actions, for the pain she'd caused, and for the life she wanted to live. I made it clear that I wasn't going to be part of her cycle of chaos anymore. The next day, my mother called. Her voice was softer than I'd ever heard it, tinged with regret. She apologized for the way she'd treated me, for the pressure she'd put on me, and for failing to see the situation for what it was. For the first time in what felt like forever, it sounded like she genuinely understood. In the weeks that followed, I focused on myself. I started therapy, picked up old hobbies, and reconnected with friends I'd drifted away from. It wasn't easy, but each day felt a little lighter than the last. The family drama faded into the background, replaced by a newfound sense of peace. By the time the leaves began to change, I realized something. I wasn't just moving on, I was rebuilding. The weight of betrayal and anger no longer defined me. I was free, finally ready to write the next chapter of my life, one where I chose happiness, not obligation.